Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honored if you subscribed. If you find yourself drawn to these explorations of humanity's hidden chapters, consider subscribing so you never miss our ventures into the forgotten realms of history. Now, make yourself comfortable as we descend into a world where healing and horror walked hand in hand, where the line between medicine and torture blurred like morning mist, and where the very act of seeking a cure could seal your fate. Picture, if you will, a world shrouded in superstition and ignorance, where the human body remained a mystery wrapped in religious taboo and ancient misconception. This was medieval Europe, an era spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, where medicine existed in a realm between primitive ritual and scholarly theory, yet remained woefully divorced from what we would recognize as scientific practice. The medieval physician cut a distinctive figure as he made his rounds through cobblestone streets and manor halls. Clad in his distinctive long robes, often black or deep blue, he carried an air of learned authority that commanded both respect and fear. Upon his head sat a peculiar pointed cap, and around his neck hung various amulets and charms believed to ward off the very diseases he sought to treat. Most striking of all was his leather beak-like mask during times of plague, stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, giving him the appearance of some otherworldly creature stepped forth from the realm of nightmares. Yet for all his imposing presence, the medieval doctor's understanding of the human body was fundamentally flawed, built upon a foundation of ancient theories that had remained largely unchanged for over 1,000 years. The dominant medical theory of the age was that of the four humours, a system inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen, whose works had been translated and preserved by Islamic scholars before making their way back to medieval Europe. According to this theory, the human body contained four vital fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was associated with specific qualities, temperatures, and even personality traits. Blood was considered hot and moist, linked to a sanguine temperament characterized by optimism and passion. Phlegm was cold and moist, associated with a phlegmatic nature marked by calmness and sluggishness. Yellow bile was hot and dry, connected to a choleric disposition of anger and irritability. Black bile was cold and dry, tied to a melancholic temperament of sadness and introspection. Health, according to this system, depended entirely upon maintaining the proper balance of these four humours within the body. Disease was simply the result of an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more humours that disrupted the body's natural harmony. This seemingly logical explanation for illness would dominate medical thinking for centuries, leading to treatments that were not only ineffective, but often more dangerous than the diseases they purported to cure. The most common and devastating of these treatments was bloodletting, a practice that would claim countless lives throughout the medieval period. Physicians believed that many illnesses resulted from an excess of blood in the body, creating a state of imbalance that could only be corrected by removing the surplus fluid. The methods employed for this grisly procedure varied, but all shared a common disregard for what we now understand about the vital role blood plays in maintaining life. The most straightforward approach involved making incisions in the patient's arms or legs with a sharp knife, allowing blood to flow freely into waiting bowls. Physicians would carefully monitor the amount of blood collected, sometimes removing quantities that would leave modern medical professionals aghast. It was not uncommon for a single bloodletting session to drain a pint or more of blood from an already weakened patient, often pushing them closer to death rather than recovery. For those who could afford more sophisticated treatment, physicians employed an array of specialized instruments designed to make the bloodletting process more precise. Sharp lancets with gleaming blades could create clean incisions, while spring-loaded devices called fleams could make multiple cuts simultaneously. The wealthy might even request the use of golden or silver instruments, believing that the noble metals would somehow purify the blood as it flowed. But perhaps the most unsettling method of bloodletting involved the use of living creatures as medical instruments. Leeches, those segmented aquatic worms with an insatiable appetite for blood, became the physician's allies in the war against humoral imbalance. These slimy creatures were collected from ponds and streams, then carefully applied to the patient's skin where they would attach themselves and begin their ghastly feast. The sight of a patient covered in writhing leeches, their bodies slowly swelling with stolen blood, must have been deeply disturbing to witness. Yet physicians praised this method for its supposed precision, claiming that leeches would instinctively know exactly how much blood to remove. In reality, these creatures simply fed until they were satiated, with no regard for the patient's well-being or survival. Even more bizarre was the practice of using heated glass cups to draw blood to the surface of the skin through suction. These cupping procedures involved lighting a candle or piece of burning material inside a glass vessel, then quickly placing the cup over the patient's skin as the flame consumed the oxygen and created a vacuum. The resulting suction would draw the skin upward into the cup, supposedly pulling corrupted humours to the surface, where they could be more easily accessed and removed. The circular marks left by cupping were considered signs of successful treatment, dark bruises that proved the physician's skill in drawing out the patient's illness. In reality, these marks were simply evidence of burst blood vessels and damaged tissue, adding injury to an already suffering body. Beyond bloodletting, medieval physicians employed an arsenal of equally disturbing treatments based on their flawed understanding of human anatomy and disease. Purging, the violent expulsion of stomach contents through induced vomiting, was considered essential for removing corrupted humours from the digestive system. Patients were forced to consume nauseating concoctions designed to trigger the most violent possible reaction, leaving them weakened and dehydrated from the ordeal. The substances used to induce vomiting were often as dangerous as the diseases they purported to treat. Mercury, a toxic heavy metal that we now know causes severe neurological damage, was commonly administered in various forms. Patients who survived the immediate effects of mercury poisoning often suffered from tremors, memory loss, and behavioral changes that were mistakenly attributed to their original illness, rather than the treatment itself. Antimony, another poisonous substance, was favored for its reliable ability to cause violent purging. This metallic element was sometimes fashioned into cups, from which patients were required to drink wine, allowing the toxic metal to leach into the liquid and ensure a thorough cleansing of the digestive system. The fact that many patients died from such treatments was often explained away as evidence that their humoral imbalance had been too severe to correct. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the medieval practice of trepanation, the surgical removal of portions of the skull to treat various ailments. This ancient procedure, which had been performed by various cultures for thousands of years, reached new heights of brutality in medieval Europe. Physicians believed that many mental and physical ailments resulted from trapped vapors or corrupted humours within the skull, conditions that could only be relieved by creating an opening to allow the harmful substances to escape. The tools used for trepanation were crude by any standard, resembling instruments of torture more than medical devices. Hand-cranked drills with rough metal bits would slowly bore through the skull bone while the patient remained conscious, as effective anesthesia did not exist. The grinding sound of metal against bone, combined with the patient's screams of agony, must have created a scene from the deepest nightmares. Some physicians preferred to use a technique called scraping, which involved using a rough metal instrument to gradually wear away portions of the skull until a hole was created. This method was considered more controlled than drilling, but it prolonged the patient's suffering considerably as the procedure could take hours to complete. The circular pieces of bone removed during trepanation were sometimes kept as medical specimens or even fashioned into amulets believed to possess healing properties. These grisly souvenirs served as reminders of the physician's skill and the patient's suffering, though they provided no actual medical benefit to anyone. Survival rates for trepanation were abysmal, with most patients dying either during the procedure or from subsequent infections. Those fortunate enough to survive often suffered from permanent brain damage, seizures, or other neurological complications that left them worse off than before the surgery. Yet physicians continued to recommend and perform trepanation throughout the medieval period, convinced that their theoretical understanding of humoral medicine justified even the most extreme interventions. The medieval physician's arsenal also included a bewildering array of substances that ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively poisonous. Crushed pearls were administered to wealthy patients as a cure for various ailments, based on the belief that their luminous beauty contained healing properties. The astronomical cost of such treatments meant that only the nobility could afford them, creating a system where the wealthy received the most exotic and supposedly powerful medicines. Powdered unicorn horn, actually the tusk of a narwhal whale, was among the most prized and expensive medicines available. This rare substance was believed to possess the power to neutralize any poison and cure virtually any disease. The fact that no one had ever actually seen a unicorn did nothing to diminish faith in the healing properties of its horn, and the exorbitant prices commanded by supposed unicorn horn made it a symbol of ultimate medical luxury. Even human body parts were considered valuable medicines under the right circumstances. The skull of a young person who had died violently was ground into powder and administered to patients suffering from epilepsy or other neurological disorders. Hair from a hanged criminal was believed to possess special properties for treating various conditions, while the fat of executed prisoners was rendered down and used as an ointment for wounds and skin ailments. These macabre remedies reflected the medieval belief that suffering and death could somehow be transformed into healing power through the proper application of medical knowledge. The more dramatic or violent the source of a medicine, the more potent it was believed to be, leading physicians to seek out increasingly disturbing materials for their treatments. Animal-based remedies were equally bizarre and often dangerous. Viper's flesh was considered an excellent treatment for leprosy, requiring patients to consume the meat of venomous snakes in the hope of curing their disfiguring disease. The logic behind this treatment was that the snake's ability to shed its skin represented a form of renewal that could be transferred to human patients suffering from skin conditions. Spider webs were commonly applied to wounds as a form of bandage, based on the observation that insects became trapped and died when they encountered these sticky structures. Physicians reasoned that spider webs must therefore possess the power to trap and destroy the evil humors that caused wounds to fester and fail to heal. In reality, the unsanitary conditions under which these webs were collected often introduced additional bacteria and contaminants to already infected wounds. The medieval fascination with astrology added another layer of complexity and danger to medical practice. Physicians believed that the movements of celestial bodies had direct influence over human health, with each part of the body governed by specific planets and zodiacal signs. Treatment timing was considered crucial, as medicines administered under the wrong astrological conditions were believed to be ineffective or even harmful. This cosmic approach to medicine meant that patients suffering from urgent conditions might be forced to wait days or weeks for the stars to align properly before receiving treatment. Emergency medical care was essentially impossible under such a system, as physicians refused to act against what they perceived as the natural order of the universe. The complexity of astrological medicine also provided physicians with a convenient excuse when their treatments failed to produce the desired results. If a patient died despite receiving proper medical care, it could always be attributed to unfavorable planetary influences or the patient's failure to follow astrological dietary restrictions. Surgical procedures, when they were attempted at all, were conducted under conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. The concept of sterile technique was completely unknown, with surgeons using the same unwashed instruments on multiple patients without any attempt at cleaning or disinfection. Operating rooms were often little more than ordinary chambers with adequate lighting, lacking any of the specialized equipment or environmental controls we associate with modern surgery. Anesthesia, as we understand it today, simply did not exist in medieval medicine. Patients undergoing surgical procedures were expected to endure the full agony of the operation while remaining conscious and aware. Some physicians attempted to dull the pain by administering large quantities of alcohol or opium-based preparations, but these primitive painkillers were often insufficient to provide meaningful relief during major procedures. The crude surgical instruments available to medieval physicians were frequently repurposed from other trades, with blacksmiths and metalworkers adapting their tools for medical use. Saws designed for cutting wood or bone were employed for amputations, while instruments originally intended for leatherworking were pressed into service for more delicate procedures. The rough, unpolished surfaces of these tools created additional trauma to tissues and provided ideal hiding places for bacteria and other contaminants. Wound care following surgery was equally primitive and dangerous. Physicians believed that pus formation was a necessary and healthy part of the healing process, actively encouraging the development of infections that they termed laudable pus. Wounds were deliberately kept open and unclean to promote this supposedly beneficial suppuration, leading to countless deaths from sepsis and other complications that could have been easily prevented with proper hygiene. The medieval understanding of anatomy was severely limited by religious prohibitions against human dissection and a reliance on ancient texts that contained numerous errors and misconceptions. Most physicians had never actually examined the inside of a human body, instead basing their knowledge on the works of ancient authorities like Galen, whose anatomical studies had been conducted primarily on animals. This second-hand knowledge led to fundamental misunderstandings about basic human physiology that persisted for centuries. The heart was believed to be the source of thought and emotion, while the brain was considered primarily a cooling system for the blood. The liver was thought to be the center of blood production, with veins and arteries believed to carry entirely different types of fluid throughout the body. Such anatomical ignorance made surgical procedures even more dangerous than they would have been under the best of circumstances. Physicians operating on patients had only the vaguest understanding of what they might encounter inside the body, leading to countless instances of accidental damage to vital organs and blood vessels. The treatment of mental illness in medieval times was particularly barbaric, reflecting a complete lack of understanding about the nature of psychological disorders. Mental patients were often believed to be possessed by demons or evil spirits, leading to treatments that focused on driving out these supernatural influences rather than addressing any underlying medical conditions. Exorcism was a common treatment for mental illness, involving prolonged rituals designed to force demonic entities to abandon their human hosts. These ceremonies could last for days or weeks, with patients subjected to constant prayers, holy water, and various religious artifacts intended to repel evil influences. The physical and psychological stress of such treatments often worsened the patient's condition significantly. When religious treatments failed to produce results, physicians might resort to more aggressive physical interventions. Patients were sometimes chained in dungeons or cellars for extended periods, based on the belief that isolation from external stimuli would allow their minds to heal naturally. The reality was that such confinement often led to further deterioration of the patient's mental state, creating a cycle of worsening symptoms and increasingly harsh treatments. Beating and other forms of physical abuse were also considered legitimate medical treatments for mental illness. Physicians believed that shocking the patient's system through pain might restore the proper balance of humours in the brain, leading to brutal sessions where patients were whipped, burned, or subjected to other forms of torture in the name of medical care. The medieval period also saw the rise of epidemic diseases that challenged the limited medical knowledge of the time and exposed the inadequacy of contemporary treatments. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed an estimated 1/3 of the population and revealed the complete helplessness of medieval medicine in the face of infectious disease. Physicians had no understanding of how the plague spread or what caused it, leading to a proliferation of theories that ranged from astrological explanations to divine punishment for human sins. Treatment attempts were based on these flawed theories, resulting in interventions that often hastened death rather than promoting recovery. Bloodletting was employed extensively during plague outbreaks, based on the belief that the disease resulted from corrupted humours that needed to be expelled from the body. Weakened plague victims were subjected to massive blood loss that left them even less capable of fighting off the infection, contributing to the astronomical mortality rates observed during epidemic periods. Other plague treatments included the burning of aromatic substances to purify the air, the wearing of protective amulets and charms, and the consumption of various herbal preparations believed to strengthen the body's natural defenses. None of these interventions had any real effect on the course of the disease, and many may have actually increased the risk of infection by encouraging people to remain in contaminated areas rather than fleeing to safer locations. The failure of medieval medicine to provide effective treatment for the plague led to widespread social upheaval and a crisis of faith in established medical authorities. People began to question the wisdom of physicians who had promised cures but delivered only death, leading to attacks on medical practitioners and the rejection of traditional treatments in favour of folk remedies and religious interventions. Yet despite these failures and the enormous suffering they caused, medieval physicians maintained their authority and continued to practice their dangerous art throughout the period. The lack of alternative explanations for disease and the human need to believe that suffering could be alleviated ensured that people continued to seek medical care, even when experience suggested that such care was more likely to harm than to help. The medieval medical system was also deeply intertwined with social and economic hierarchies that determined who received treatment and what kind of care they could expect. Wealthy patients could afford the services of university-trained physicians who, despite their flawed knowledge, at least had access to the most current medical theories and the finest instruments available. Poor patients, on the other hand, were more likely to receive care from local healers, barber surgeons, and other practitioners whose knowledge was even more limited and whose methods were often more dangerous. These lower-tier medical providers lacked access to expensive medicines and sophisticated instruments, leading them to rely on cruder and more brutal interventions. The economic incentives of medieval medical practice also encouraged physicians to recommend expensive and dramatic treatments over simpler and potentially more effective approaches. Bloodletting, purging, and surgical procedures commanded higher fees than basic nursing care or dietary recommendations, creating a system where financial considerations often overrode medical judgment. This commercialization of suffering meant that patients who could afford to pay were more likely to receive aggressive and dangerous treatments, while those who could not pay were more likely to be left alone to recover naturally. Paradoxically, the poor often had better survival rates simply because they could not afford the interventions that were killing their wealthier neighbours. As we delve deeper into the dark secrets of medieval medicine, we begin to understand how a system built on ignorance, superstition, and economic exploitation could persist for centuries, despite its obvious failures. The combination of religious authority, social hierarchy, and the absence of scientific method created an environment where dangerous practices could flourish unchallenged, leaving countless victims in their wake. The legacy of medieval medicine serves as a sobering reminder of the importance of evidence-based practice and the dangers of accepting medical interventions based solely on tradition or authority. The suffering endured by medieval patients was not simply the result of limited technology or knowledge, but of a systematic failure to question established beliefs and practices in the face of overwhelming evidence of their inadequacy. Looking at the provided reference materials and your script summary, I'll continue the medieval medicine script with part 2, focusing on the psychological and social dimensions of these dark practices, while maintaining the engaging documentary-style tone. As we delve deeper into the shadowy corridors of medieval medical practice, we encounter perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all, the complete absence of what we would recognize today as informed consent or patient advocacy. In this era, the physician wielded absolute authority over the bodies and fates of those who sought healing, creating a dynamic that was as much about power and social control as it was about medicine. Picture, if you will, the typical medieval patient. Whether peasant or noble, they entered the physician's domain in a state of complete vulnerability and ignorance. Medical knowledge was jealously guarded by the learned elite, written in Latin and shrouded in mystical terminology that served to maintain the doctor's elevated status. Patients had no understanding of their conditions, no knowledge of alternative treatments, and certainly no right to refuse the prescribed remedies, no matter how bizarre or dangerous they might seem. The psychological impact of this power imbalance cannot be overstated. Imagine being told by a learned man, draped in the authority of both church and university, that your salvation depended upon submitting to procedures that your every instinct told you to flee from. The medieval patient existed in a constant state of terror, caught between the fear of their illness and the horror of their treatment. This dynamic was particularly cruel for women, who faced an additional layer of medical misogyny that pervaded every aspect of their care. Medieval physicians, almost exclusively male, viewed the female body as inherently corrupt and mysterious. Women's health issues were routinely attributed to moral failings or supernatural influences, leading to treatments that were as much about punishment as they were about healing. Consider the medieval understanding of childbirth, one of the most natural and fundamental human experiences. Rather than being seen as a normal biological process, childbirth was viewed as a curse imposed upon womankind for Eve's original sin. This theological framework meant that women in labor were often denied pain relief, as their suffering was considered both deserved and spiritually necessary. When complications arose, the solutions were typically barbaric. Crude surgical interventions without anesthesia, violent manipulations, or the administration of toxic substances believed to speed delivery. The mortality rates tell the grim story. It's estimated that between 10 and 20% of medieval women died in childbirth, with many more suffering permanent injuries that would plague them for the remainder of their often shortened lives. Yet rather than prompting medical professionals to question their methods, these tragic outcomes were simply accepted as God's will, or blamed on the moral character of the deceased. Mental health presented another arena where medieval medicine revealed its darkest impulses. The concept of mental illness as we understand it today simply did not exist. Instead, those suffering from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or other psychological conditions were viewed through the lens of moral and spiritual failure. The treatments that emerged from this worldview were nothing short of torturous. Exorcism was considered a standard treatment for what we would now recognize as mental illness. Patients were subjected to violent rituals designed to cast out the demons believed to be possessing them. These ceremonies could last for days, involving physical restraints, prolonged fasting, exposure to extreme temperatures, and psychological torture designed to break the supposed demonic hold. Many patients died during these ordeals, their deaths attributed to the strength of the evil forces within them, rather than the brutality of their treatment. For those who survived exorcism but showed no improvement, the next step was often confinement in conditions that can only be described as dungeons. Medieval hospitals for the mentally ill were essentially prisons where patients were chained to walls, fed scraps, and left to exist in their own filth. The theory was that physical discomfort would shock the soul back into proper alignment, but the reality was simply systematic dehumanization of society's most vulnerable members. The economic dimensions of medieval medicine added yet another layer of darkness to an already grim picture. Healthcare was not a right, but a luxury, available only to those who could afford to pay. This created a perverse incentive structure where physicians had financial motivation to prescribe the most expensive and elaborate treatments possible, regardless of their effectiveness or safety. Wealthy patients often received treatments that were paradoxically more dangerous than those given to the poor, simply because they could afford more exotic, and therefore supposedly more powerful remedies. A rich merchant might be prescribed rare imported minerals or complex alchemical preparations that could easily prove fatal, while a poor peasant received simple herbs that, while ineffective, were at least unlikely to cause immediate harm. This economic stratification extended to every aspect of medical care. The wealthy could afford multiple consultations, allowing them to shop around for physicians who told them what they wanted to hear. They could import medicines from distant lands, hire private nurses, and retreat to country estates to recover in relative comfort. The poor, meanwhile, had no choice but to accept whatever treatment was offered, often from practitioners with minimal training and no accountability. The fee structure itself was designed to extract maximum profit from desperate patients. Physicians charged not just for their services, but for each component of their treatments. Every herb, every bloodletting session, every consultation carried a separate cost. Families often bankrupted themselves trying to save a loved one, only to watch them die anyway from the very treatments they had sacrificed everything to afford. Perhaps most disturbing was the way this economic model incentivized the prolonging of illness rather than its cure. A healthy patient was no longer a source of income, creating a perverse situation where successful treatment was actually contrary to the physician's financial interests. While most medieval doctors probably did not consciously prolong their patients' suffering, the system they operated within certainly encouraged practices that kept patients dependent and returning for more expensive treatments. The religious establishment played a crucial role in maintaining and legitimizing these medical horrors. The Church's doctrine that suffering was spiritually purifying provided convenient cover for treatments that caused tremendous pain. Physicians could justify their most brutal procedures by claiming they were helping patients achieve spiritual as well as physical healing through the redemptive power of suffering. This religious framework also served to suppress any questioning of medical authority. To challenge a physician's treatment was tantamount to questioning God's plan, a form of heresy that could have serious consequences. Patients and their families were expected to submit to whatever torments were prescribed, viewing their agony as a test of faith rather than a failure of medicine. The Church's control over education meant that medical training was deeply intertwined with religious doctrine. Future physicians learned their craft not through empirical observation and experimentation, but through the study of ancient texts considered sacred and unquestionable. This created a medical establishment that was fundamentally conservative and resistant to change, viewing innovation as dangerous pride rather than beneficial progress. The psychological manipulation embedded in medieval medical practice was sophisticated and systematic. Physicians cultivated an aura of mystical knowledge and divine authority that made questioning their methods seem not just foolish, but spiritually dangerous. They spoke in Latin, surrounded themselves with arcane instruments and mysterious substances, and performed elaborate rituals that served no medical purpose, but reinforce their status as intermediaries between the earthly and divine realms. Patients were deliberately kept in a state of ignorance and dependency. Medical procedures were explained, if at all, in terms so vague and mystical that they conveyed no real information. This wasn't simply due to the limitations of medieval scientific understanding, but was a deliberate strategy to maintain the physician's authority and the patient's compliance. The placebo effect, though not understood in modern terms, was ruthlessly exploited. Elaborate ceremonies, expensive ingredients, and painful procedures all served to convince patients that they were receiving powerful medicine. The more a treatment cost, the more it hurt, and the more mysterious it seemed, the more likely patients were to believe in its efficacy. This psychological manipulation often produced temporary improvements that served to validate the physician's methods, even when the underlying condition remained unchanged or worsened. Social pressure played an enormous role in maintaining this system of medical abuse. Families who refused conventional treatment for their loved ones faced ostracism and suspicion. Communities rallied around the authority of established physicians, viewing those who sought alternative approaches as dangerous radicals or heretics. This social enforcement made it extremely difficult for individuals to break free from the cycle of harmful medical intervention, even when their own experience suggested that the treatments were making things worse. The few voices that dared to question medieval medical orthodoxy were quickly silenced. Physicians who advocated for gentler treatments or questioned established procedures found themselves accused of incompetence or heresy. Patients who recovered using non-traditional methods were often dismissed as having experienced miraculous intervention rather than effective treatment, preventing their experiences from challenging the medical establishment. This systematic suppression of dissent meant that medieval medicine became trapped in a cycle of self-reinforcing error. Harmful practices were maintained not because they worked, but because the system was designed to prevent any meaningful evaluation of their effectiveness. Success was credited to the physician's skill, while failure was blamed on the patient's moral failings, the severity of their condition, or divine will. The legacy of these dark medieval practices extended far beyond the immediate suffering they caused. They established patterns of medical authority and patient submission that would persist for centuries, creating cultural attitudes about medicine and healing that we are still working to overcome today. The idea that effective medicine must be unpleasant, that patients should not question their doctors, and that suffering is an inevitable part of healing, all have their roots in medieval medical practice. Understanding this history is crucial, not just for appreciating how far medical science has progressed, but for recognizing the ongoing importance of patient rights, informed consent, and evidence-based practice. The horrors of medieval medicine remind us that good intentions are not enough, that tradition and authority are poor substitutes for empirical evidence, and that the power dynamics between doctor and patient must be carefully balanced to prevent abuse. As we continue our exploration of medieval medicine's darkest chapters, we must remember that behind every barbaric procedure and misguided treatment were real human beings enduring unimaginable suffering. Their pain was not made meaningful by the religious and philosophical frameworks used to justify it, nor was their sacrifice in service of medical progress any less tragic for being unintentional. They were victims of a system that prioritized authority over evidence, tradition over innovation, and profit over compassion. The medieval period may seem distant and irrelevant to our modern medical challenges, but the fundamental questions it raises about power, knowledge, and healing remain as pressing today as they were 800 years ago. How do we balance respect for medical expertise with the need for patient autonomy? How do we prevent economic incentives from corrupting medical practice? How do we ensure that our current medical orthodoxies don't blind us to better approaches? These are the lessons that the dark history of medieval medicine has to teach us, written in the blood and tears of countless forgotten patients who deserved so much better than what their age had to offer. Here's part 3 of The Dark Secrets of Medieval Medicine. As we delve deeper into the shadowy realm of medieval medicine, we encounter perhaps the most chilling aspect of all: the complete absence of what we now consider basic human rights in medical treatment. In our modern world, we take for granted the fundamental principle of informed consent, the right to refuse treatment, and the expectation that medical practitioners will first do no harm. But in medieval times, these concepts were not merely underdeveloped, they were utterly non-existent. Picture, if you will, a peasant suffering from what we would now recognize as depression or anxiety. In the medieval mind, such conditions were often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment for sin. The treatment prescribed might involve being chained in a monastery cell, subjected to exorcism rituals involving hours of prayer, fasting, and physical restraint. The patient had no voice in this process, no right to question the treatment, and certainly no legal recourse if the cure proved worse than the ailment. The concept of medical consent was so foreign to medieval thinking that patients were often treated more like livestock than human beings. When a physician decided that bloodletting was necessary, the patient's opinion was not merely irrelevant, it was considered potentially dangerous, as questioning medical authority was tantamount to questioning God's will. After all, illness was widely believed to be either divine punishment or a test of faith, and the physician was seen as God's instrument for delivering either cure or righteous suffering. This paternalistic approach extended to every aspect of medical care. Surgical procedures, no matter how invasive or experimental, were performed without explanation to the patient. A surgeon might decide to amputate a limb, drill holes in a skull, or remove internal organs based entirely on his own judgment, often influenced by astrological charts or religious beliefs rather than medical evidence. The patient's role was simply to endure whatever treatment was deemed necessary, regardless of their own wishes or concerns about the procedure. Women, children, and the poor faced even more severe violations of what we would now consider basic human dignity. Medieval medical texts routinely described treatments for women that were based on the assumption that they were naturally inferior and prone to hysteria. The wandering womb theory, which suggested that women's psychological and physical ailments were caused by their uterus literally moving around inside their body, led to treatments that were both absurd and traumatic. Women might be subjected to strong-smelling substances applied to their genitals to lure the womb back to its proper position, or have weights tied to their bodies to prevent the organ from wandering. Children were viewed as miniature adults, with no special consideration for their developmental needs or psychological well-being. Medical treatments designed for adults were simply scaled down and applied to children, often with devastating results. A child suffering from fever might be bled until they lost consciousness, or given adult doses of toxic substances that could cause permanent damage or death. Parents had little choice but to submit their children to whatever treatment the physician recommended, as refusing medical care was often seen as both legally and morally irresponsible. The economic dimensions of this system added another layer of exploitation and abuse. Wealthy patients, while still lacking true consent rights, at least had the financial means to seek multiple opinions or refuse certain treatments. They could afford to shop around for physicians whose approaches seemed less extreme, or could retreat to private estates to avoid unwanted medical interventions. The poor, however, were completely at the mercy of whatever medical charity was available, often finding themselves subjected to experimental treatments by physicians eager to practice new techniques on patients who had no recourse. Monastic hospitals, while providing care for the destitute, operated under strict religious hierarchies that gave patients even less autonomy than secular medical facilities. Monks and nuns who served as healers saw themselves as instruments of divine will. and any resistance to treatment was viewed as resistance to God Himself. Patients in these institutions might find themselves subjected to religious conversion attempts alongside their medical treatment, with spiritual healing taking precedence over physical comfort or recovery. The legal framework of medieval society actively reinforced these abusive dynamics. Under feudal law, peasants and serfs were considered property of their lords, with no independent legal standing. This meant that medical decisions could be made by landowners rather than patients themselves, with treatments chosen based on economic considerations rather than medical need. A lord might refuse expensive treatments for a sick peasant, or conversely, might insist on costly procedures if the peasant was particularly valuable as a worker. Perhaps most disturbing was the medieval medical establishment's complete lack of accountability for treatment outcomes. When patients died or were permanently harmed by medical interventions, these results were typically attributed to God's will, the patient's moral failings, or the advanced stage of their disease. Physicians faced no systematic oversight, no peer review, and no legal consequences for treatments that caused obvious harm. This created an environment where medical practitioners could experiment freely on human subjects without fear of repercussions. The psychological impact of this system on patients was profound and lasting. People lived in constant fear not only of disease and injury, but of the medical treatments that might be imposed upon them. Stories circulated of patients who suffered more from their cures than from their original ailments, creating a culture of medical anxiety that permeated medieval society. Many people preferred to suffer in silence rather than seek medical help, knowing that the cure might be worse than the disease. This fear was particularly acute among marginalized groups who were already vulnerable to persecution. Jews, Muslims, and other religious minorities often avoided seeking medical care from Christian physicians, knowing that they might be subjected to forced conversion attempts or blamed for their illnesses. Women who sought help for reproductive health issues risked being labeled as witches or morally corrupt, especially if their conditions were related to sexuality or childbirth complications. The intersection of medical practice with religious and social control created a system where healing was inseparable from moral judgment and social conformity. Physicians saw themselves not just as treaters of physical ailments, but as enforcers of social order and religious orthodoxy. A patient who questioned treatment might find themselves accused of heresy or moral corruption, facing punishment that extended far beyond their original medical complaint. This comprehensive violation of human dignity in medical settings reflected and reinforced the broader power structures of medieval society. Just as peasants had no voice in political decisions that affected their lives, they had no voice in medical decisions that might determine their survival. The same hierarchical thinking that justified feudalism and absolute monarchy also justified medical paternalism and the complete subordination of patient autonomy to physician authority. The long-term consequences of this approach to medical care extended far beyond individual patient experiences. By treating people as passive recipients of medical intervention rather than active participants in their own healing, medieval medicine failed to develop many of the psychological and social support systems that we now know are crucial for recovery. Patients who were denied agency in their treatment often experienced depression, anxiety, and learned helplessness that complicated their physical healing and prolonged their suffering. Moreover, the authoritarian structure of medieval medicine stifled innovation and critical thinking that might have led to genuine medical advances. When patients could not question treatments or report adverse effects. Without fear of retribution, physicians received little feedback about the actual effectiveness of their interventions. This created a closed system where harmful practices could persist for centuries without challenge, protected by the very authority structures they served. The legacy of medieval medicine's disregard for patient rights can be traced through centuries of medical history. influencing attitudes toward medical authority that persisted well into the modern era. Even today, we can see echoes of this paternalistic approach in medical systems that prioritize physician convenience over patient autonomy, or that fail to adequately inform patients about treatment risks and alternatives. As we reflect on these dark chapters in medical history, we gain a deeper appreciation for the hard-won rights and protections that modern patients enjoy. The principles of informed consent, patient autonomy, and medical accountability that we now take for granted were revolutionary concepts that emerged only after centuries of struggle against the authoritarian medical traditions established in medieval times. These advances represent not just improvements in medical technique, but fundamental shifts in our understanding of human dignity and the relationship between healers and those they serve. The medieval approach to medical care serves as a stark reminder of what happens when healing becomes divorced from compassion, when authority replaces empathy, and when the powerful are allowed to treat the vulnerable as mere objects for their intervention rather than as human beings deserving of respect, dignity, and choice in their own care. Looking at the provided context about medieval medicine and the reference script style, I'll continue the narrative focusing on medical treatments and their horrific consequences. The barbaric nature of medieval medical treatments extended far beyond the crude theories that guided them. In the shadowy chambers of medieval healers, patients endured procedures that would make modern torture seem merciful by comparison. The most common surgical interventions were performed without any understanding of sterile technique or pain management, turning what should have been healing into a nightmarish ordeal of agony and infection. Consider the fate of a typical patient suffering from what physicians diagnosed as an excess of blood. The prescribed treatment of bloodletting was carried out with a variety of terrifying instruments. Barber surgeons would slice open veins with rusty knives, attach blood-sucking leeches to the skin, or use cupping glasses heated over flames to draw blood to the surface. Patients often lost so much blood that they died from the treatment rather than their original ailment. The sight of these procedures was so ghastly that many witnesses fainted, yet physicians viewed the resulting weakness and pale complexion as signs of successful treatment. The horror intensified when dealing with internal ailments. Medieval doctors believed that purging the body of corrupt humours required the most violent means possible. They administered concoctions containing mercury, lead, and arsenic, substances we now know to be deadly poisons. Patients who survived these toxic treatments often suffered permanent damage to their organs, developing tremors, madness, and slow, agonizing deaths from heavy metal poisoning. The physicians, observing the dramatic symptoms these poisons produced, interpreted the violent reactions as evidence that the medicine was working effectively. Perhaps most disturbing was the complete absence of any concept of informed consent or patient rights. Medieval physicians operated under the assumption that their authority was absolute and divinely sanctioned. Patients had no say in their treatment, no right to refuse procedures, and no recourse when treatments went horribly wrong. A physician could decide to amputate a limb, drill holes in a skull, or administer deadly poisons based solely on their flawed understanding of humoral theory, and the patient was expected to submit without question. The social hierarchy of medieval society reinforced this medical tyranny. Wealthy patients might receive slightly gentler treatment, but even nobles were subject to the same barbaric procedures. Poor patients, however, were often used as test subjects for experimental treatments, or subjected to the most brutal interventions with even less care. Women, children, and marginalized groups faced additional horrors, as they were considered less valuable and therefore suitable for the most dangerous procedures. The training of medieval physicians was equally appalling. Medical education was based entirely on ancient texts that were often mistranslated or misunderstood. Students never observed actual human anatomy, instead learning from books filled with anatomical errors and fantastical theories. When they did encounter real patients, they applied these flawed teachings with deadly confidence. The result was a generation of healers who were not only incompetent, but actively harmful. The economic incentives of medieval medicine created a system that prioritized elaborate, expensive procedures over effective care. Physicians were paid more for dramatic interventions than for simple remedies or preventive care. This led to a medical culture that favored spectacular but useless treatments over humble but effective ones. A physician who prescribed rest and good nutrition earned far less than one who performed bloodletting, administered exotic potions, or conducted surgical procedures. The psychological impact of medieval medical practices on both patients and practitioners was devastating. Patients lived in constant fear of falling ill, knowing that seeking medical help might be worse than suffering in silence. The trauma of undergoing medieval medical procedures often left survivors permanently damaged, not just physically but mentally. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder from their encounters with medieval healers. Even the practitioners themselves were not immune to the horror of their profession. Many physicians privately questioned the effectiveness of their treatments, but were trapped by the rigid dogma of medical orthodoxy. Those who dared to suggest alternative approaches faced persecution from medical authorities and religious leaders. The few who attempted to observe and document actual results were dismissed as heretics, challenging divine wisdom. The tools and instruments used in medieval medicine were themselves instruments of torture. Surgical knives were often dull and dirty, bone saws were crude and imprecise, and cauterizing irons were heated to extreme temperatures that caused excruciating pain. The lack of proper sterilization meant that every instrument was a potential source of deadly infection. Operating theaters were filthy chambers where multiple patients might be treated with the same unwashed tools, spreading disease and contamination. The medieval approach to childbirth exemplified the deadly combination of ignorance and arrogance that characterized the era's medical practices. Women in labor were subjected to procedures based on superstition rather than understanding. Physicians might administer herbs that caused dangerous contractions, perform unnecessary interventions that increase bleeding, or use instruments that caused internal injuries. The maternal mortality rate was horrifically high, yet physicians blamed the deaths on the inherent weakness of women rather than examining their own practices. Mental illness was perhaps the most misunderstood condition in medieval medicine. Physicians attributed madness to demonic possession, humoral imbalances, or moral failings. Treatments included exorcism, violent purging, physical restraints, and isolation in conditions that would drive any sane person to madness. Patients with mental health conditions were often subjected to the most brutal treatments, as their inability to advocate for themselves made them perfect victims for medical experimentation. The legacy of medieval medical practices extended far beyond the immediate harm they caused. The authoritarian model of medicine that developed during this period established patterns of medical dominance that persisted for centuries. The idea that physicians should have absolute authority over patients, that medical knowledge should be guarded by an elite class, and that dramatic interventions are superior to gentle care all have their roots in medieval medical culture. The systematic suffering inflicted by medieval medicine was not an accident or a result of primitive conditions alone. It was the inevitable outcome of a medical system built on false theories, social hierarchies, and economic incentives that rewarded spectacle over healing. The physicians of the medieval era were not simply ignorant. They were participants in a system of institutionalized medical violence that prioritized authority and profit over human welfare. This dark chapter in medical history serves as a stark reminder of what happens when medical practice becomes divorced from empirical observation, when social hierarchies override human compassion, and when economic interests triumph over patient welfare. The screams of medieval patients echo through history, as a warning about the dangers of medical authoritarianism and the vital importance of evidence-based, patient-centered care. Part 5 of 12, The Merchants of Misery, Medical Commerce and Exploitation. The acrid smoke of burning herbs drifted through the narrow streets of London as Master Aldrich the apothecary arranged his wares in the flickering candlelight. Glass vials filled with murky liquids lined his shelves, each promising miraculous cures for ailments both real and imagined. But behind the ornate labels and exotic ingredients lay a darker truth. Medieval medicine had become a ruthless marketplace where human suffering was transformed into profit, and desperate patients became prey for unscrupulous practitioners. In the shadowy world of medieval medical commerce, the line between healer and charlatan blurred beyond recognition. Physicians, apothecaries, barber surgeons, and traveling quacks all competed in a brutal economy where the currency was pain and the merchandise was hope. This was not the noble art of healing that modern medicine aspires to be, but rather a predatory system that exploited the most vulnerable members of society with calculated precision. The rise of medical commerce in medieval Europe created a perfect storm of exploitation. As cities grew and trade flourished, medicine transformed from a charitable calling into a lucrative business. The emergence of guilds gave certain practitioners monopolistic control over medical practice, allowing them to manipulate prices and eliminate competition. Meanwhile, the absence of any meaningful regulation meant that anyone could claim to be a healer, regardless of their qualifications or intentions. At the apex of this medical hierarchy stood the university-trained physicians, men who wielded their education like a weapon against the ignorant masses. These learned doctors commanded astronomical fees for their services, often charging the equivalent of several months' wages for a single consultation. They dressed in elaborate robes and spoke in Latin not to demonstrate their knowledge, but to mystify and intimidate patients who dared question their authority. Master Bartholomew was one such physician, a graduate of the University of Salerno, who had built his reputation on theatrical diagnoses and expensive treatments. When summoned to attend a wealthy merchant's daughter suffering from fever, he would arrive with great ceremony, examining the patient's urine in ornate glass vessels while muttering learned phrases in Latin. His prescription would invariably involve rare and costly ingredients: powdered unicorn horn from the distant Orient, mercury imported from Spain, or exotic herbs that could only be obtained through his own carefully controlled network of suppliers. The patient's recovery or death mattered little to Master Bartholomew's reputation. If she recovered, it was proof of his superior skill and learning. If she died, it was clearly because the family had waited too long to seek his expertise, or perhaps they had failed to follow his precise instructions. The physician's position was unassailable, protected by the mystique of university learning and the desperate hope of suffering families. But the exploitation extended far beyond simple overcharging. Medieval physicians developed elaborate systems of artificial scarcity to maximize their profits. They claimed that certain treatments could only be administered during specific phases of the moon, or that particular herbs lost their potency if not harvested by virgin maidens at dawn. These fabricated restrictions served no medical purpose, but allowed doctors to control supply and demand with surgical precision. The practice of astrology became a particularly insidious tool of medical exploitation. Physicians claimed that treatment could only begin when the celestial bodies were properly aligned, forcing patients to wait weeks or even months while their conditions worsened. During this enforced delay, families would often spend their life savings on preliminary treatments, special diets, and protective amulets, all prescribed by the same physician who would eventually provide the real cure. Master Aldrich the apothecary represented another tier of medical exploitation. Unlike the lofty physicians with their university credentials, apothecaries operated in the murky middle ground between legitimate medicine and outright fraud. His shop was a carefully crafted theatre of deception, filled with impressive displays of rare ingredients and mysterious apparatus designed to awe credulous customers. The apothecary's art lay not in healing, but in the sophisticated manipulation of hope and fear. He maintained detailed records of his customers' ailments, family histories, and financial circumstances, using this intelligence to craft personalized sales strategies. For the wealthy widow suffering from melancholy, he might recommend an expensive course of imported saffron and gold leaf. For the desperate father of a dying child, he would suggest increasingly costly treatments, each one promising to be the breakthrough that finally cures the condition. Aldrich's most profitable customers were those suffering from chronic conditions that required ongoing treatment. He developed a particular expertise in managing these relationships, providing just enough relief to maintain hope while ensuring that the underlying condition never fully resolved. His treatments for gout, for example, would provide temporary pain relief, but included ingredients that actually worsened the condition over time, guaranteeing that customers would return again and again. The apothecary's workshop behind his shop revealed the true nature of his operation. Here, common herbs were repackaged with exotic labels and inflated prices. Sand was mixed with genuine spices to increase volume. Cheap animal bones were ground up and sold as rare medicinal powders. Most shocking of all, many of his most expensive preparations contained nothing but colored water and alcohol. Their supposed potency derived entirely from the customer's faith in their healing properties. But perhaps no group embodied the predatory nature of medieval medical commerce more completely than the traveling quacks and mountebanks who roamed from town to town, selling miracle cures to anyone desperate enough to believe their claims. These medical nomads operated beyond the reach of local authorities, appearing suddenly in market squares with elaborate performances designed to separate the gullible from their money. Magister Cornelius was one such charlatan, a man whose theatrical skills far exceeded his medical knowledge. He would arrive in each new town with great fanfare, setting up an elaborate stage complete with exotic animals, mysterious apparatus, and beautiful assistants. His performance began with seemingly miraculous demonstrations: a crippled man suddenly walking, a blind woman regaining her sight, a mute child speaking for the first time. These miraculous cures were, of course, carefully orchestrated frauds. The patients were confederates, skilled actors who traveled with Cornelius from town to town. Their convincing portrayals of suffering and subsequent healing served to establish the quack's reputation and create a mob of eager customers clamoring for their own miracle cures. Cornelius's actual products were a study in sophisticated deception. His universal panacea was nothing more than cheap wine mixed with herbs and honey, but he sold it for prices that reflected its supposed ability to cure everything from plague to lovesickness. His elixir of youth contained mercury and other toxic substances that often made customers sicker, leading them to purchase additional treatments to counteract the poisoning. The most insidious aspect of these traveling frauds was their exploitation of community trust networks. Cornelius would typically remain in each town for several weeks, long enough for word of his successes to spread through local social networks. He carefully cultivated relationships with respected community members, bribing them with free treatments or percentage of sales in exchange for their endorsements. By the time the truth about his fraudulent treatments became apparent, Cornelius would have moved on to the next unsuspecting community, leaving behind a trail of sick and impoverished victims. The delayed nature of many medical conditions meant that months might pass before the full extent of his deception became clear, and by then, he was safely beyond the reach of justice. The economic structure of medieval medical practice created perverse incentives that actively worked against patient welfare. Since doctors were paid per treatment rather than for successful outcomes, they had every reason to prolong illnesses and prescribe the most expensive possible interventions. The concept of preventive medicine was virtually unknown. not because medieval practitioners lacked the knowledge to promote health, but because healthy people generated no revenue. This fee-for-service model led to the development of deliberately harmful treatment protocols designed to create dependency relationships between practitioners and patients. Physicians would prescribe treatments that provided temporary relief while actually worsening the underlying condition, ensuring a steady stream of return visits. Mercury treatments for syphilis, for example, often caused more damage than the disease itself, leading to a cascade of additional health problems that required ongoing medical intervention. The guild system that governed medical practice in many medieval cities created additional opportunities for exploitation. These professional organizations, supposedly established to maintain standards and protect patients, actually functioned as cartels designed to maximize practitioner profits. Guild regulations artificially limited the number of licensed physicians, creating artificial scarcity that drove up prices. They also prohibited competition from unlicensed healers, no matter how effective their treatments might be. Guild physicians worked together to maintain unified pricing structures and treatment protocols, eliminating the possibility of price competition that might benefit patients. They shared information about wealthy customers, coordinating their approaches to maximize extraction of fees. When a prominent merchant fell ill, multiple guild members might consult on the case, each charging substantial fees for their participation in what was essentially a coordinated shakedown operation. The licensing systems controlled by these guilds were themselves tools of exploitation. Prospective physicians were required to pay enormous fees for the privilege of practicing medicine, costs that were inevitably passed on to patients through higher charges. The examination process was designed not to test actual medical competence, but to ensure that new practitioners understood and would perpetuate the guild's exploitative practices. Women practitioners faced particularly severe discrimination under this system, not because they lacked medical skill, but because they threatened the male-dominated power structure that controlled medical commerce. Female healers, who often provided effective treatments at affordable prices, were systematically driven out of practice through accusations of witchcraft and unlicensed practice. Their elimination served the dual purpose of maintaining guild monopolies while reinforcing patriarchal control over women's bodies and economic opportunities. The church played a complex and often contradictory role in medical commerce. While officially promoting charity and care for the sick, ecclesiastical authorities frequently partnered with medical practitioners in exploitative schemes. Monasteries operated hospitals that functioned more like profit centers than charitable institutions, charging fees for basic care and selling expensive treatments to wealthy patients. Religious authorities also provided ideological justification for medical exploitation through their teachings about suffering and divine will. Patients were told that their illnesses were punishments for sin, and that expensive treatments and donations to the church were necessary for both physical and spiritual healing. This theological framework made it virtually impossible for patients to question medical authority without also challenging religious doctrine. The most sophisticated medical exploiters understood the power of combining religious and medical authority. They positioned themselves as divinely inspired healers, claiming that their treatments were revealed through prayer and spiritual insight. This religious veneer made their practices virtually immune to criticism, since questioning their methods amounted to questioning God himself. Pilgrimages to holy sites became another avenue for medical exploitation. Sick and desperate people would travel hundreds of miles to visit shrines and holy relics, spending their life savings on the journey and the various treatments and blessings offered by local clergy. The temporary improvement that many pilgrims experienced, often due simply to the rest and change of environment, was attributed to divine intervention, reinforcing the cycle of religious medical exploitation. The pharmaceutical trade that developed around these religious sites was particularly predatory. Vendors sold blessed medicines, holy water, and pieces of saints' clothing at astronomical prices to desperate pilgrims. The fact that these items had no actual medical value was irrelevant. Their supposed spiritual properties justified any price that the market would bear. Medieval medical texts and treatises, supposedly repositories of healing knowledge, were often little more than elaborate marketing materials designed to promote expensive treatments and establish practitioner authority. These learned works were filled with complex theories and obscure terminology that served to mystify rather than educate, creating an artificial barrier between medical knowledge and common understanding. The proliferation of medical texts also created new opportunities for exploitation through the education market. Aspiring physicians were required to purchase expensive books and hire tutors to understand their contents, costs that were ultimately passed on to patients through higher fees. The deliberate complexity of medical education served no therapeutic purpose, but created a lucrative secondary market for those who controlled access to medical knowledge. Perhaps most perniciously, the commercialization of medieval medicine corrupted the very definition of health and illness. Conditions that might have been considered normal variations in human experience were medicalized and transformed into profitable diseases requiring expensive treatment. Natural processes like aging, childbirth, and grief were pathologized, creating vast new markets for medical intervention. The concept of the worried well, healthy people convinced that they needed medical treatment, was actively cultivated by medieval practitioners who understood that the most profitable patients were those who weren't actually sick. These practitioners developed elaborate diagnostic techniques designed to find problems where none existed, creating artificial demand for their services among the wealthy who could afford a regular medical attention. The legacy of medieval medical commercialization extended far beyond simple financial exploitation. By transforming healing from a charitable calling into a profit-driven enterprise, medieval medical commerce established patterns of exploitation that would persist for centuries. The fundamental conflict between practitioner profit and patient welfare that characterized medieval medicine continues to influence medical systems to this day. The systematic dehumanization of patients that emerged during this period, the treatment of sick people as sources of revenue rather than human beings deserving of care, represented a profound moral failure that undermined the entire premise of medical practice. When healers became merchants and patients became customers, the sacred trust that should exist between caregiver and patient was irreparably corrupted. The merchants of misery who dominated medieval medical practice left behind a legacy of suffering that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. Their exploitation of human vulnerability and their corruption of the healing arts created deep-seated suspicions about medical authority that persist to this day. They demonstrated how quickly noble intentions could be corrupted by commercial incentives, and how easily systems designed to help could be transformed into instruments of exploitation. As we reflect on this dark chapter in medical history, we see not just the story of individual greed and corruption, but a systematic failure to protect the most vulnerable members of society from those who would exploit their suffering. The merchants of misery who profited from medieval medical practice remind us that the commercialization of healthcare is not a modern phenomenon, but an ancient corruption that requires constant vigilance to prevent. The medieval medical marketplace, with its elaborate frauds and sophisticated exploitation, stands as a cautionary tale about what happens when profit becomes the primary motive in healthcare. It shows us how quickly the noble art of healing can be corrupted when commercial incentives override ethical obligations, and how devastating the consequences can be for those who depend on medical care for their survival. In examining these historical patterns of medical exploitation, we gain crucial insights into the eternal tension between commerce and compassion in healthcare. The merchants of misery who dominated medieval medicine may be long dead, but the systems they created and the attitudes they fostered continue to influence medical practice today, reminding us that the fight for ethical healthcare is never truly won, but must be waged anew by each generation. The medieval world was a harsh place where life hung by the thinnest of threads, and nowhere was this more evident than in the medical practices of the time. What we've explored so far reveals a system built on ignorance, exploitation, and genuine cruelty masquerading as healing. But there remains one more dark aspect of medieval medicine that perhaps cuts deepest of all: the complete absence of hope for genuine recovery or relief. In our modern world, when we fall ill, we expect to get better. We visit doctors with the reasonable assumption that medical intervention will help us heal, that pain can be managed, that diseases can be cured. This fundamental expectation of recovery is so ingrained in our thinking that we can barely imagine a world without it. Yet for the medieval patient, hope itself was a luxury they could rarely afford. Consider the psychological torment of living in an age where every minor ailment could signal the beginning of the end. A simple cut might fester and turn gangrenous. A persistent cough could herald the onset of consumption. A fever might be the first sign of plague. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that their bodies were fragile vessels sailing on turbulent seas, with no reliable means of navigation or rescue. The wealthy, at least, could afford the elaborate theatrics of medical attention. They could summon physicians with their impressive robes and learned Latin phrases, purchase exotic remedies from distant lands, and commission prayers from entire monasteries. But even these expensive interventions offered little more than the illusion of control. The rich died just as frequently and painfully as the poor, their gold unable to purchase what did not yet exist: effective medical knowledge. For the common people, even this illusion was beyond reach. When a peasant fell ill, their options were brutally limited. They might seek help from a local wise woman who knew which herbs could ease certain symptoms, though even beneficial plants were often prepared incorrectly or contaminated with harmful substances. They could pray, of course, and many did so with desperate fervor, believing that their suffering was either divine punishment for sins or a test of faith that might be rewarded with miraculous healing. But more often than not, illness meant simply enduring. Medieval people developed a stoic acceptance of pain that seems almost superhuman by today's standards. They had no choice but to bear excruciating toothaches until the affected teeth fell out or were crudely extracted. They lived with chronic conditions that caused constant discomfort, knowing that relief would likely never come. Women faced the terrifying prospect of childbirth, knowing that many would not survive it, and that even if they did, watching their children die of preventable diseases was a near certainty. The psychological impact of this hopelessness cannot be overstated. Medieval literature is filled with references to the body as a prison, to earthly life as a vale of tears, to death as a welcome release from suffering. While these themes were certainly influenced by Christian theology, they also reflected the lived reality of people who had little reason to expect their physical circumstances to improve. This despair was compounded by the medical profession's own arrogance and ignorance. Physicians, despite their lack of effective treatments, maintained an air of authority that brooked no questioning. They created elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain disease and suffering, but these frameworks served primarily to protect their own status rather than to help patients. A physician could always explain away a treatment's failure by blaming the patient's constitution, their moral failings, or the alignment of celestial bodies. The doctrine of the four humours, in particular, created a closed system of explanation that was virtually immune to contradiction. If bloodletting failed to cure a fever, it was because the patient had too much phlegm, not enough bile, or required a different balance altogether. If a patient died despite treatment, it was because their humoral imbalance was too severe, or because they had waited too long to seek help, or because their lifestyle had corrupted their natural constitution beyond repair. This systematic deflection of responsibility meant that medical practitioners rarely had to confront the reality of their own ineffectiveness. They could continue to practice harmful procedures while maintaining their sense of professional competence and social standing. Meanwhile, patients and their families were left to blame themselves for treatment failures, adding guilt and self-recrimination to their already overwhelming burden of physical suffering. The absence of hope extended beyond individual illness to epidemic disease, which struck medieval communities with terrifying regularity. The Black Death, which killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, was only the most dramatic example of medicine's helplessness in the face of widespread disease. When plague struck a community, physicians fled alongside everyone else who had the means to do so. Those who remained had nothing to offer but prayers and increasingly desperate remedies that often hastened death rather than preventing it. During plague outbreaks, the normal social structures that provided at least some comfort to the sick and dying completely collapsed. Families abandoned their own members out of fear of contagion. The dead were buried in mass graves without ceremony. The very physicians who claimed special knowledge of the human body proved utterly useless when their expertise was most needed. These experiences seared into the medieval consciousness a deep understanding of medicine's fundamental powerlessness. Yet perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval medicine's hopelessness was how it was disguised and rationalized by those in authority. The Church taught that suffering was spiritually beneficial, that earthly pain was temporary compared to eternal salvation, and that accepting one's afflictions with patience and faith was the highest virtue. While these teachings may have provided some comfort to the suffering, they also served to discourage any serious effort to improve medical knowledge or develop better treatments. Political authorities, meanwhile, had little incentive to invest in medical advancements when their own power rested on maintaining existing social hierarchies. A peasant who died of preventable disease was simply replaced by another peasant. The suffering of the common people was seen as natural and inevitable, not as a problem requiring solution. Even among medical practitioners themselves, there was little recognition that their methods might be fundamentally flawed. The entire system of medical education was based on memorizing ancient texts rather than observing actual patients. Students learned to recite Galen's theories about blood flow without ever dissecting a human body to see how circulation actually worked. They studied elaborate charts of astrological influences on health without conducting controlled experiments to test whether these influences existed. This educational approach created generations of physicians who were intellectually equipped to debate theoretical points, but practically incapable of helping real patients. They could discourse learnedly about the proper balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humours, but they could not recognize the symptoms of common diseases or understand how infections spread. The result was a medical system that was simultaneously highly sophisticated in its theoretical complexity and utterly primitive in its practical effectiveness. Medieval physicians developed elaborate diagnostic procedures, complex pharmaceutical preparations, and detailed treatment protocols that rivaled anything found in the modern world for their intricacy and systematization. But all of this intellectual apparatus was built on foundations of sand, theoretical assumptions that bore little relationship to biological reality. For the medieval patient, this meant living in a world where medical authority was both omnipresent and useless. They were surrounded by people who claimed to understand their bodies and their ailments, who spoke with confidence about causes and cures, who demanded payment and obedience for their services. Yet when crisis struck, when real healing was needed, these authorities had nothing meaningful to offer. The psychological damage of this false hope may have been worse than no hope at all. At least a person who expects nothing can prepare mentally for suffering and death. But those who place their trust in supposed experts, who submit to painful procedures in the belief that healing will follow, who exhaust their resources pursuing treatments that cannot work, experienced not only physical suffering, but the additional torment of betrayed faith. This betrayal was particularly acute because medieval medicine demanded so much from its patients while delivering so little in return. Treatments were often more painful than the diseases they supposedly cured. Patients were required to endure bloodletting until they fainted, purging until they were dangerously dehydrated, surgical procedures without anesthesia, and pharmaceutical preparations that were essentially poison. They submitted to these ordeals because they trusted that their physicians knew what they were doing, that the immediate suffering would lead to eventual relief. When relief failed to materialize, when the patient's condition worsened or death approached despite compliance with medical advice, the fault was invariably placed on the patient rather than the treatment. They had not bled enough, had not purged completely, had not maintained the proper diet, had not prayed with sufficient fervor, had not aligned their lifestyle with the physician's recommendations. This systematic victim blaming meant that medical failure never led to medical reform, only to more elaborate explanations for why the failures were really the patient's fault. The hopelessness of medieval medicine was thus not merely a matter of technological limitation or scientific ignorance, though these were certainly factors. It was also a product of social, economic, and intellectual systems that actively prevented the accumulation of genuine medical knowledge, while protecting the interests of those who profited from medical ignorance. As we look back on this dark chapter in human history, we can perhaps better appreciate the extraordinary transformation that has occurred in the relationship between healer and patient. The expectation that medical intervention will generally help rather than harm, that physicians will base their treatments on evidence rather than theory, that patients have rights and choices in their care, that suffering can often be alleviated even when cures are not available. These are revolutionary concepts that would have been almost incomprehensible to our medieval ancestors. Yet we should not congratulate ourselves too quickly on our progress. The dark legacy of medieval medicine still echoes in our modern world whenever patients are treated as objects rather than people, whenever economic interests override medical ethics, whenever authority figures demand blind obedience rather than informed consent, whenever suffering is dismissed or ignored because it affects the powerless rather than the privileged. The true horror of medieval medicine was not just that it failed to heal, but that it systematically crushed the human spirit by offering false hope while delivering real harm. In understanding this history, we can better appreciate both how far we have come and how vigilant we must remain to protect the hard-won principles of ethical medical practice that distinguish our age from theirs. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials provided, I'll continue the medieval medicine script with part 7. Here's the continuation, focusing on the economic exploitation and systemic corruption within medieval medical practices. The true horror of medieval medicine extended far beyond the barbaric treatments and primitive understanding of disease. At its rotten core lay a web of economic exploitation so pervasive and cruel that it transformed human suffering into profit, creating a system where the wealthy thrived while the poor were literally bled dry, both figuratively and literally. Picture, if you will, the medieval physician arriving at a manor house, his fine robes rustling as he dismounts from his well-fed horse. His leather satchel contains instruments of torture disguised as medical tools, and his purse jingles with coins already collected from his previous victims. This was no healer driven by compassion, but a businessman whose commodity was desperation itself. The medical guilds of medieval Europe operated as exclusive cartels, controlling who could practice medicine and setting prices that only the wealthy could afford. These guilds functioned much like modern monopolies, crushing competition and maintaining artificial scarcity to drive up their fees. A single consultation with a guild-certified physician could cost a peasant family their entire year's earnings, forcing them to choose between medical treatment and starvation. But the physicians were merely the most visible predators in this ecosystem of exploitation. Below them swarmed a host of lesser medical practitioners, each finding their own way to extract wealth from human misery. Barber surgeons charged exorbitant fees for procedures that were more likely to kill than cure. Apothecaries mixed worthless powders and sold them as miracle cures, their shops filled with jars of coloured water and ground animal bones, marketed as exotic remedies from distant lands. The most insidious aspect of this system was how it preyed upon the ignorant and desperate. Travelling quacks would arrive in villages during plague outbreaks, selling protection charms and cure-all potions to terrified peasants who would trade their last coins for false hope. These charlatans understood that fear was their most valuable ally, and they cultivated it expertly, spreading rumours of curses and supernatural diseases that only their special remedies could address. Consider the story of Master Edmund, a notorious travelling physician who terrorised the countryside of 13th century England. Edmund would arrive in a village claiming to have received divine visions about an impending plague. He would then offer to protect the entire community through a complex ritual involving expensive imported herbs and blessed oils. The villagers, already living in constant fear of disease and death, would pool their meagre resources to pay Edmund's astronomical fees. After performing his meaningless ceremonies and collecting his payment, Edmund would disappear in the night, leaving behind a community impoverished but temporarily convinced of their protection. The economic structure of medieval medicine created perverse incentives that actively discouraged actual healing. Physicians were paid for their services regardless of outcomes, and successful treatment meant losing a paying customer. This led to the development of deliberately prolonged treatment regimens designed to extract maximum payment from patients. Bloodletting, for instance, was often prescribed as a series of treatments rather than a single procedure, ensuring repeated visits and fees. Women faced particular exploitation within this system, as their medical needs were often dismissed or deliberately misunderstood to justify expensive and unnecessary treatments. Childbirth, a natural process that had been successfully managed by midwives for millennia, was increasingly medicalized by male physicians who insisted that their intervention was necessary for safety. These physicians would prescribe elaborate and costly preparations for pregnant women, including exotic herbs and expensive bloodletting procedures, while simultaneously undermining the traditional knowledge of experienced midwives. The apothecary shops of medieval towns were theatres of deception, their shelves lined with impressive-looking jars and bottles containing substances that range from useless to actively harmful. Powdered unicorn horn, sold at prices that could bankrupt a merchant family, was actually ground narwhal tusk or horsebone. Theriac, a supposed universal antidote that commanded enormous prices, was typically a mixture of wine, honey, and whatever herbs the apothecary had in surplus. Mummy powder, allegedly ground from Egyptian mummies and sold as a cure for various ailments, was usually manufactured from the bodies of executed criminals or even fresh corpses. The church, supposedly committed to caring for the sick and poor, was itself deeply complicit in this system of medical exploitation. Monasteries operated as medical centers, but their services were rarely free. Patients were expected to make substantial donations to the monastery, and those who could not pay were often turned away or given inferior care. The church also profited from the sale of religious relics claimed to have healing properties, charging desperate families enormous sums for the privilege of touching a saint's bone or drinking water that had allegedly been blessed by a miracle worker. Perhaps most cruelly, the medieval medical establishment deliberately maintained ignorance among the general population to preserve their monopoly on healing. Medical knowledge was kept in Latin, ensuring that common people could not understand or question treatments. Physicians would speak in mysterious technical terms and perform elaborate rituals designed to impress and intimidate patients rather than heal them. This deliberate obfuscation meant that people could not evaluate the effectiveness of treatments or seek alternatives, leaving them entirely dependent on the medical establishment's claimed expertise. The economic incentives of medieval medicine also corrupted research and innovation. Rather than seeking better treatments, physicians focused on developing more impressive-looking procedures that could justify higher fees. The most successful medical practitioners were often those who could put on the most convincing theatrical performances, complete with elaborate costumes, mysterious instruments, and dramatic incantations. Actual medical knowledge was secondary to the ability to extract payment from desperate patients. The guild system created artificial barriers to entry that prevented talented healers from practicing if they lacked the proper social connections or financial resources to buy their way into the profession. Many effective folk remedies and treatments were dismissed or suppressed not because they were ineffective, but because they threatened the economic interests of established practitioners. Traditional healers, often women with generations of practical experience, were marginalized or even persecuted as witches when their success threatened the profits of guild physicians. The legal system of medieval Europe was thoroughly corrupted by medical interests, with laws written to protect physicians from consequences when their treatments failed or caused harm. Patients had virtually no recourse when medical treatment resulted in death or permanent injury, as physicians could always claim that the patient's condition was simply too advanced to cure, or that the treatment would have worked if applied sooner. This legal immunity encouraged reckless experimentation on patients, particularly those from lower social classes who had no political power to seek justice. International trade in medical supplies created opportunities for massive fraud and exploitation. Merchants would import cheap local herbs and market them as exotic remedies from distant lands, charging enormous markups for substances that were readily available locally. The demand for rare medical ingredients led to the development of sophisticated counterfeiting operations, with entire workshops dedicated to creating fake versions of expensive medicines. These counterfeit remedies were often not merely ineffective, but actively dangerous, containing toxic substances that could poison patients while enriching their cellars. The educational system that trained medieval physicians was itself a form of economic exploitation, with students required to pay enormous fees for the privilege of learning outdated and often harmful medical theories. Medical schools operated as profit centers rather than institutions of learning, with professors more interested in collecting tuition than in advancing medical knowledge. Students were taught to memorize ancient texts rather than to observe and experiment, ensuring that each new generation of physicians would perpetuate the same profitable but harmful practices as their predecessors. The economic corruption of medieval medicine created a vicious cycle where the sickest and most vulnerable members of society were systematically exploited by those who claimed to help them. Families would sell their homes, livestock, and possessions to pay for medical treatments that not only failed to cure their loved ones, but often hastened their deaths. The medical establishment's profits were literally built on human suffering, creating a system where disease and desperation were transformed into wealth for a privileged few. This economic exploitation had devastating effects that extended far beyond individual patients. Entire communities could be impoverished by medical expenses during plague outbreaks or other health crises. The drain of resources into the coffers of medical practitioners meant less money available for food, housing, and other necessities, actually contributing to the poor health and high mortality rates that characterized medieval life. The medical system was not merely failing to improve health, it was actively making society sicker and poorer, while enriching those who claimed to be healers. The legacy of this corrupt system extended far beyond the medieval period, establishing patterns of medical exploitation that would persist for centuries. The idea that medical care should be a privilege of the wealthy rather than a basic human right, the practice of maximizing profits from human suffering, and the deliberate maintenance of ignorance to preserve professional monopolies all became entrenched features of medical practice that would take centuries to overcome. Understanding the economic dimensions of medieval medicine reveals that the barbaric treatments and primitive theories were not merely products of ignorance, but were actively maintained and promoted by a system that profited from human misery. The physicians, apothecaries, and other medical practitioners of the medieval period were not simply misguided healers doing their best with limited knowledge. They were active participants in a system of exploitation that deliberately perpetuated suffering for financial gain. This economic corruption was perhaps the darkest secret of medieval medicine, transforming what should have been a caring profession into a predatory industry that fed on human desperation and left a trail of impoverished families and unnecessary deaths in its wake. Here's part 8 of The Dark Secrets of Medieval Medicine. As we have seen, the medical establishment of medieval times was a carefully orchestrated system of exploitation and control, where the suffering of ordinary people became the foundation for vast fortunes and unchecked power. Yet perhaps no aspect of this dark enterprise was more insidious than the way it infiltrated the very minds and souls of its victims, transforming them into willing participants in their own destruction. The psychological manipulation employed by medieval medical practitioners was sophisticated beyond measure, preying upon humanity's most fundamental fears and vulnerabilities. Death, disease, and divine judgment formed a trinity of terror that medical charlatans wielded with masterful precision. They understood that a frightened patient was a compliant patient, and a compliant patient was a profitable patient. Consider the elaborate rituals surrounding diagnosis in medieval medicine. When a physician arrived at a patient's bedside, he did not simply examine the afflicted person and prescribe treatment. Instead, he orchestrated a theatrical performance designed to inspire both awe and dependency. Dressed in flowing robes and mysterious masks, especially during plague outbreaks, these medical performers created an atmosphere of mystique and authority that few dared question. The physician would begin by consulting elaborate charts, mapping the supposed influence of celestial bodies on human health. He would study the patient's urine not for any genuine diagnostic purpose, but to create the impression of arcane knowledge and supernatural insight. The urine would be held up to the light, swirled in glass vessels, and subjected to pronouncements about its color, consistency, and mystical properties. This uroscopy, as it was called, was pure theatre, yet it convinced countless patients that their physician possessed otherworldly wisdom. But the psychological manipulation went far deeper than mere showmanship. Medieval medical practitioners understood that hope and despair could be manufactured and sold just as readily as any physical remedy. They perfected the art of delivering diagnoses that were simultaneously terrifying and hopeful, creating a psychological dependency that would last for months or even years. A typical consultation might proceed as follows. The physician would gravely announce that the patient's humors were severely imbalanced, their soul was in mortal peril, and their condition was advancing towards certain death. The patient and their family would be plunged into despair, desperate for any intervention that might prevent this horrible fate. Then, just as hope seemed lost, the physician would reveal that he possessed rare knowledge and exotic treatments that might, with God's blessing and substantial payment, restore the patient to health. This emotional manipulation was calculated to extract maximum financial benefit from the patient's terror. Families would sell possessions, borrow money, and pledge future earnings to pay for treatments that promised salvation from the physician's dire predictions. The more elaborate and expensive the treatment, the more credible it seemed to desperate patients who reasoned that surely such costly interventions must be powerful and effective. The medical establishment also exploited religious fear with ruthless efficiency. In a deeply Christian society where eternal damnation was considered a very real possibility, physicians positioned themselves as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual realms. They claimed that illness was often a manifestation of sin, and that their treatments could provide not only bodily healing, but spiritual purification. This religious dimension allowed medical practitioners to blame treatment failures on the patient's moral shortcomings rather than their own incompetence. If a patient died despite expensive interventions, it was because they lacked sufficient faith, harbored secret sins, or had failed to complete the prescribed spiritual exercises that accompanied the physical treatments. This conveniently absolved the physician of responsibility while reinforcing the notion that medical authority was divinely sanctioned. The psychological conditioning began in childhood and continued throughout life. Children were taught that their bodies were mysterious vessels prone to corruption and imbalance, requiring constant vigilance and professional intervention. They learned to fear their own physical sensations and to distrust their natural healing processes. A simple headache became a potential sign of brain fever. A minor cut might herald the onset of gangrene. Any deviation from perfect health was cause for alarm and medical consultation. This cultivation of medical anxiety served the financial interests of practitioners while undermining people's confidence in their own bodies and judgment. Patients learned to interpret every ache, pain, or unusual sensation through the lens of medical catastrophe, creating a constant market for professional services and exotic remedies. The medieval medical establishment also perfected techniques of social pressure and peer manipulation that modern marketers would recognize and admire. Physicians cultivated networks of satisfied customers who would testify to the miraculous effects of their treatments. These testimonials were carefully orchestrated, featuring patients who attributed their recovery from minor ailments to the physician's intervention, while conveniently ignoring the natural healing that would have occurred anyway. More sinister still was the practice of creating medical dependencies through the deliberate use of addictive substances. Many popular remedies contained opium, alcohol, or other mind-altering compounds that provided temporary relief while creating long-term dependence. Patients would return again and again, not because the treatments were effective, but because they had become physically or psychologically dependent on the substances contained in the medicines. The physicians understood that addiction was more profitable than cure. A patient who recovered completely would no longer require their services, but a patient dependent on their remedies would provide a steady stream of income for years or even decades. This perverse incentive structure encouraged the development of treatments designed to manage symptoms rather than address underlying causes. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way medieval medical practitioners exploited the bonds of family and community to increase their profits and influence. They understood that people would sacrifice almost anything for the health of their loved ones, and they designed their practices to maximize this emotional leverage. When a child fell ill, physicians would not simply treat the child. Instead, they would convince the parents that the entire family was at risk, that the child's condition might be contagious or hereditary, and that preventive treatments for all family members were essential. This transformed a single patient into multiple revenue streams while deepening the family's dependence on medical intervention. The exploitation of parental love was particularly cruel and effective. Mothers and fathers, desperate to protect their children, would submit to any treatment, pay any price, and endure any humiliation if it offered even the slightest hope of preserving their child's health. Physicians preyed upon this vulnerability with treatments that were not only useless, but often harmful, justifying their interventions with elaborate theories about preventing future illness or strengthening the child's constitution. Community pressure was also systematically manipulated to increase compliance with medical authority. Physicians would publicly praise patients who followed their recommendations while subtly ostracizing those who questioned their methods or sought alternative treatments. They cultivated relationships with religious leaders, local officials, and influential community members who would reinforce the message that resistance to medical authority was dangerous, foolish, and potentially sinful. This social engineering created environments where questioning medical practices became virtually impossible. Patients who expressed doubts about their treatment were made to feel ignorant, ungrateful, and spiritually deficient. They were told that their skepticism demonstrated a lack of faith in God's chosen healers and might actually impede their recovery by interfering with the spiritual aspects of the healing process. The medieval medical establishment also pioneered techniques of information control that would be familiar to modern propagandists. They restricted access to medical knowledge, ensuring that only trained physicians could read and interpret medical texts. This monopoly on information made it impossible for patients to evaluate their treatment independently or to seek second opinions from knowledgeable sources. Medical texts were written in Latin, making them inaccessible to the vast majority of the population, who spoke only vernacular languages. This linguistic barrier reinforced the mystique surrounding medical knowledge while preventing patients from discovering the often absurd theories and dangerous practices that formed the basis of their treatment. When medical information did circulate among the general population, it was often deliberately distorted or incomplete. Physicians would share selected facts that supported their authority while concealing information that might lead to uncomfortable questions about their methods or qualifications. This selective disclosure created an illusion of transparency while maintaining essential mysteries that protected professional interests. The economic exploitation inherent in this system was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Medieval medical practitioners developed elaborate fee structures that maximized their income while minimizing their accountability. They charged separately for consultation, diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up care, ensuring multiple revenue streams from each patient encounter. The pricing was deliberately opaque and variable, allowing physicians to adjust their fees based on the patient's apparent wealth and desperation. A wealthy merchant might be charged 10 times more than a poor peasant for identical treatment, with the physician justifying the difference by claiming that the wealthy patient required more sophisticated interventions or higher quality ingredients. Payment was often demanded in advance before any treatment was provided. This practice protected physicians from non-payment while ensuring that patients remained committed to completing expensive treatment regimens. Families who had already invested substantial sums were reluctant to abandon their physician, even when treatment proved ineffective, reasoning that they had already paid too much to quit without seeing results. The medieval medical establishment also developed sophisticated methods of risk management that protected practitioners from the consequences of their failures while maximizing their profits from successes. When patients recovered, physicians claimed full credit for the cure and used the success story to attract new customers. When patients died or suffered complications, the failure was attributed to factors beyond the physician's control: the patient's lack of faith, the advanced stage of the disease, interference from evil spirits, or the will of God. This asymmetrical attribution of outcomes created a powerful psychological bias that reinforced medical authority even in the face of repeated failures. Patients and their families remembered the occasional successes while rationalizing away the more frequent failures, creating a distorted perception of medical effectiveness that served the profession's interests. The manipulation extended even to the timing and duration of treatments. Physicians understood that chronic conditions were more profitable than acute illnesses, so they developed treatment protocols that prolonged rather than resolved medical problems. A patient with a simple infection might be subjected to months of bloodletting, purging, and dietary restrictions that weakened their immune system and delayed natural recovery. The psychological impact of this systematic exploitation was profound and lasting. Medieval people learned to view their own bodies as unreliable and dangerous, requiring constant professional supervision and intervention. They developed learned helplessness in the face of illness, believing that recovery was impossible without expensive medical treatment, and that their own healing instincts were dangerous delusions. This medical conditioning shaped entire societies, creating cultures of hypochondria and medical dependency that persisted for generations. People lost confidence in traditional healing practices that had sustained their ancestors for millennia, abandoning herbal remedies, dietary therapies, and other folk treatments in favor of the elaborate interventions promoted by professional physicians. The social consequences were equally devastating. Medical expenses became a major cause of poverty and debt, as families bankrupted themselves pursuing treatments that rarely provided genuine benefit. The concentration of wealth in the hands of medical practitioners contributed to growing social inequality, as resources flowed from sick and desperate patients to healthy and prosperous physicians. Perhaps most tragically, the medieval medical establishment's emphasis on elaborate interventions and exotic treatments diverted attention and resources away from simple public health measures that could have prevented many illnesses. Instead of focusing on clean water, adequate nutrition, and sanitary living conditions, society invested its limited resources in bloodletting equipment, astrological charts, and imported remedies that did nothing to address the root causes of disease. The legacy of this systematic exploitation extended far beyond the medieval period. The patterns of medical authority, professional monopoly, and patient manipulation established during these centuries created templates that would be refined and perpetuated by later generations of medical practitioners. The fundamental dynamic of asymmetrical power between physician and patient, the use of fear and hope as tools of control, and the prioritization of profit over genuine healing became deeply embedded in medical culture. Even today, we can see echoes of medieval medical practices in modern healthcare systems that prioritize expensive interventions over prevention, that discourage patient autonomy and informed consent, and that create dependencies rather than promoting genuine health and healing. The dark secrets of medieval medicine are not merely historical curiosities, but warning signs of what happens when healing becomes subordinated to power and profit. Understanding this history is essential for anyone seeking to navigate modern medical systems with wisdom and discernment. The same psychological vulnerabilities that medieval physicians exploited still exist today, and the same techniques of manipulation and control continue to be employed by those who would prioritize their own interests over genuine patient welfare. As we reflect on these disturbing revelations about medieval medical practice, we must ask ourselves difficult questions about the systems we have inherited and the institutions we trust with our health and well-being. Only by understanding how medical authority can be corrupted and abused can we hope to create healing systems that truly serve human flourishing rather than professional ambition and financial gain. Part 9. The Dark Secrets of Medieval Medicine. Within the shadowy corridors of medieval hospitals and the cramped chambers where physicians practiced their craft, a sinister truth lurked beneath the veneer of healing. The medical establishment of the Middle Ages was not merely incompetent or primitive, it was systematically corrupt, deliberately exploitative, and ruthlessly profit-driven. The very institutions and practitioners that claimed to offer salvation from disease instead created a web of deception, greed, and calculated cruelty that ensnared the desperate and vulnerable. The medieval medical guild system represented one of the most insidious forms of organized exploitation in human history. These powerful brotherhoods of physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries operated as closed societies, jealously guarding their secrets while manipulating both knowledge and access to maximize their wealth and influence. Guild membership was not earned through demonstrated healing ability or compassionate service, but through family connections, political maneuvering, and the payment of substantial fees that kept the poor permanently excluded from the ranks of legitimate practitioners. These medical guilds functioned as elaborate protection rackets, using their monopolistic control to crush competition and maintain artificially high prices for their services. Independent healers, herbalists, and midwives who dared to practice without guild approval faced harassment, prosecution, and even execution on charges of witchcraft or unlicensed practice. The guilds worked hand in glove with secular and religious authorities to eliminate anyone who might offer affordable alternatives to their expensive and often harmful treatments. The guild system created a deliberate scarcity of medical knowledge, ensuring that healing remained the exclusive province of a privileged elite. Apprenticeships were limited and expensive, designed to perpetuate a hereditary caste of medical practitioners who passed their secrets from father to son, while keeping the broader population in ignorance. Medical texts were written in Latin, making them inaccessible to common people who might otherwise learn to treat themselves or their families. This artificial monopoly on medical knowledge allowed physicians to charge exorbitant fees for even the simplest treatments. Perhaps most perniciously, the guild system actively suppressed medical innovation and the development of effective treatments. Guild members had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, as new discoveries or more effective remedies might threaten their established practices and revenue streams. Physicians who dared to challenge accepted wisdom or experiment with new approaches faced expulsion from the guild and professional ruin. This systematic resistance to progress condemned countless patients to unnecessary suffering and death while protecting the financial interests of the medical establishment. The corruption within medieval medical guilds extended far beyond mere professional protectionism. Guild masters often demanded sexual favors from the wives and daughters of patients in exchange for treatment, using their position of power to exploit the most vulnerable members of society. They routinely accepted bribes to falsify death certificates, helping wealthy families avoid inheritance taxes or cover up murders. Guild physicians would deliberately prolong treatments to extract maximum payment from patients, prescribing expensive but ineffective remedies when simpler, cheaper solutions were available. The medieval apothecary trade represented another layer of systematic fraud and exploitation within the medical establishment. Apothecaries, who prepared and sold medicines, operated elaborate schemes to deceive customers about the contents and efficacy of their preparations. They would substitute cheap, common ingredients for expensive, rare ones, selling ground chalk as powdered pearls or colored water as exotic elixirs from distant lands. These fraudulent practices were not occasional lapses, but standard business procedures designed to maximize profits at the expense of patient welfare. Apothecaries developed sophisticated methods for adulterating their medicines with harmful substances that would produce dramatic but temporary effects, convincing patients that the treatment was working even as it slowly poisoned them. They would add mercury to skin preparations, knowing it would produce a temporary clearing of blemishes while causing long-term neurological damage. Opium was routinely added to pain remedies without informing patients, creating addiction that ensured repeat customers while slowly destroying their health and cognitive function. The trade in exotic medical ingredients became a vast international network of fraud and deception. Merchants would travel to distant lands, returning with stories of miraculous herbs and rare substances while selling common weeds and minerals at enormous markups. The famous theriac, supposedly containing dozens of exotic ingredients, including viper's flesh and rare spices, was often nothing more than honey, mixed with common herbs and whatever scraps the apothecary had on hand. These fraudulent preparations were sold at prices that could bankrupt entire families, with apothecaries claiming they were essential for survival. Medieval physicians perfected the art of prognostication as a tool for manipulation and control, using their supposed ability to predict the course of illness to extract maximum payment from desperate families. They would deliberately deliver vague, ominous predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways, allowing them to claim accuracy regardless of the outcome, while keeping patients and families in a state of anxious dependency. Physicians learned to read social cues and family dynamics, tailoring their predictions to exploit existing fears and tensions within households. The practice of uroscopy became an elaborate theater of deception, with physicians claiming to diagnose everything from pregnancy to demonic possession, by examining a patient's urine. In reality, most physicians had no special knowledge about urine analysis, but relied on cold reading techniques, leading questions, and careful observation of the patient's behavior and appearance to make educated guesses about their condition. The mystical apparatus of uroscopy, the special flasks, the charts of urine colors, the solemn rituals of examination served primarily to impress patients and justify high fees for what was essentially medical theatre. Medieval physicians exploited religious beliefs and superstitions to enhance their authority and justify their failures. They would claim that unsuccessful treatments were the result of the patient's insufficient faith or hidden sins, shifting blame away from their own incompetence while maintaining their reputation for infallibility. Physicians routinely prescribed prayers, pilgrimages, and religious ceremonies alongside their medical treatments, knowing that any improvement could be attributed to their intervention, while any deterioration could be blamed on spiritual failings. The medical establishment's relationship with the church created additional opportunities for exploitation and abuse. Physician monks used their religious authority to coerce patients into donating money or property to monasteries in exchange for treatment, claiming that spiritual healing required material sacrifice. They would threaten patients with eternal damnation if they sought treatment elsewhere or questioned prescribed remedies, using fear of hell to enforce compliance with expensive and often harmful medical regimens. Medieval hospitals, rather than being centers of healing, often functioned as warehouses for the dying, where patients were systematically robbed of their remaining possessions before being abandoned to die in squalor. Hospital administrators would convince dying patients to sign over their property to the institution in exchange for promises of care that were rarely delivered. Patients who entered hospitals with valuable possessions would mysteriously worsen and die, their belongings disappearing into the hospital's coffers, while their families were told that everything possible had been done. The practice of medical consultation became an elaborate confidence game, with physicians deliberately confusing patients with technical jargon and contradictory advice to create dependency and justify repeated visits. Multiple physicians would work together in consultation schemes, each recommending expensive treatments while supporting the other's authority, creating an echo chamber of medical opinion that patients found impossible to challenge. These consultation networks allowed physicians to share profits while presenting a united front against any questioning of their methods or competence. Medieval surgery, when performed at all, was often conducted with deliberate brutality designed to demonstrate the surgeon's power and justify enormous fees. Surgeons would perform unnecessary procedures, claiming they were essential while knowing they would likely cause more harm than good. The lack of anesthesia was sometimes deliberate rather than simply due to ignorance, as conscious patients could be more easily intimidated and controlled during procedures. Surgeons would deliberately prolong operations to increase drama and justify higher payments, turning medical procedures into gruesome spectacles. The treatment of mental illness revealed the medical establishment's capacity for systematic cruelty and exploitation. Physicians would diagnose madness in inconvenient family members, particularly women who challenged male authority or threatened inheritance arrangements, providing medical justification for imprisonment or abuse. The supposed treatments for mental illness, including beating, starvation, and exposure to extreme temperatures, were often indistinguishable from torture, serving primarily to break the patient's spirit and demonstrate the physician's power over life and death. Perhaps most damning of all was the medical establishment's deliberate perpetuation of ignorance and superstition among the general population. Physicians actively discouraged patients from learning about their own bodies or attempting self-treatment, claiming that medical knowledge was too dangerous for common people to possess. They spread false information about anatomy and disease causation, ensuring that patients remained dependent on professional medical services, even for conditions that could be easily treated with simple home remedies. The legacy of medieval medical corruption extended far beyond the Middle Ages, establishing patterns of professional exploitation and institutional abuse that would influence medical practice for centuries to come. The guild system's emphasis on exclusivity and profit over patient welfare, the deliberate mystification of medical knowledge, and the use of professional authority to exploit vulnerable populations created templates for medical abuse that persist in various forms even today. The dark secrets of medieval medicine reveal not merely the primitive state of medical knowledge in that era, but the fundamental corruption of institutions and individuals who place their own interests above the welfare of those they claim to serve, leaving a trail of suffering and exploitation that stands as one of history's most shameful examples of systematic professional abuse. Here's the script for part 10 of The Dark Secrets of Medieval Medicine. The corruption and exploitation we've explored in medieval medicine would be incomplete without examining one of its most insidious aspects: the systematic destruction of patient rights and informed consent. In our modern era, we take for granted the fundamental principle that patients have the right to understand their treatment, to refuse procedures, and to seek second opinions. These concepts were not merely absent in medieval medicine, they were actively suppressed as threats to the established medical hierarchy. Medieval physicians operated under the assumption that patients were incapable of understanding their own conditions or making informed decisions about their care. This paternalistic approach served multiple purposes for the medical establishment. First, it eliminated any possibility of patients questioning treatments or demanding explanations for bizarre procedures. Second, it created a mystique around medical knowledge that justified exorbitant fees and elevated social status. Third, it provided convenient cover for medical incompetence and experimental procedures performed without consent. The concept of informed consent was not simply overlooked, it was viewed as heretical. Physicians believed that explaining treatments to patients would undermine their authority and potentially harm the patient through worry or disbelief. This philosophy conveniently ignored the reality that many medical procedures were based on superstition rather than sound medical principles. By keeping patients ignorant, physicians could perform bloodletting, purging, and other harmful treatments without resistance. Consider the typical interaction between a medieval physician and patient. The physician would arrive, often days after being summoned, due to the scarcity of medical practitioners, and immediately begin pontificating about humoral imbalances and astrological influences. The patient, already weakened by illness, would be subjected to a barrage of incomprehensible Latin terms and mystical explanations. Questions were discouraged, and any attempt by the patient or family to understand the proposed treatment was met with condescension or outright hostility. The physician's examination, if it could be called that, was perfunctory at best. Many practitioners refused to touch their patients directly, considering it beneath their station. Instead, they relied on visual inspection, examination of urine colour, and consultation of astrological charts. The patient's own description of their symptoms was often dismissed as unreliable, despite being the most accurate source of information available. Once a diagnosis was pronounced, usually involving an imbalance of the four humours, treatment would begin immediately, without any explanation of potential risks or alternative approaches. Patients had no right to refuse treatment, no opportunity to seek second opinions, and no recourse if treatments failed or caused harm. The medical establishment had constructed a perfect system of unaccountable authority. The economic incentives driving this system were enormous. Physicians charged premium fees for their mysterious knowledge and elaborate procedures. The more complex and incomprehensible the treatment appeared, the higher the fees that could be justified. Bloodletting, for example, was presented as a precise science requiring years of training to master, when in reality it was a crude and often fatal procedure that any barber could perform. The guild system ensured that this exploitation could continue unchecked. Medical guilds controlled who could practice medicine, what treatments were acceptable, and how much could be charged. They actively suppressed competition from folk healers, midwives, and other practitioners who might offer more effective or affordable care. Any physician who questioned established practices or advocated for patient rights faced expulsion from the guild and loss of livelihood. Women were particularly vulnerable to medical exploitation. Female patients were considered especially incapable of understanding medical matters and were often treated without their consent or even their knowledge. Husbands or male relatives made all medical decisions, and women's own accounts of their symptoms were routinely dismissed. During childbirth, male physicians increasingly displaced experienced midwives, despite having no practical experience with delivery, and often making situations worse through intervention. The treatment of mental illness exemplified the complete absence of patient rights. Individuals suffering from what we now recognize as depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions were subjected to horrific treatments, including confinement, starvation, beating, and exorcism. Families could have relatives declared insane and confined indefinitely without any legal protections or appeal process. The patient's own perspective on their condition was considered irrelevant or evidence of their madness. Religious authorities collaborated with physicians to suppress patient autonomy. The Church taught that suffering was divinely ordained and that questioning medical authority was tantamount to questioning God's will. Patients were expected to submit passively to whatever treatments were prescribed, viewing their suffering as penance for sin. This religious framework provided powerful psychological pressure to accept even the most brutal procedures without complaint. The documentation of medical practices reveals the callous disregard for patient welfare that characterized medieval medicine. Physicians kept detailed records of their fees and theoretical discussions of treatments, but rarely recorded patient outcomes or reactions to procedures. When patients died or suffered complications, it was attributed to the advanced state of their illness or their lack of faith, never to medical error or inappropriate treatment. Experimental procedures were commonplace, performed without any concept of ethical oversight or patient consent. Physicians would try new combinations of drugs, attempt novel surgical techniques, or test theoretical treatments on patients who had no idea they were being used as test subjects. The results of these experiments were rarely documented systematically, meaning that harmful procedures might be repeated indefinitely without any learning from previous failures. The legal system provided no protection for patients harmed by medical malpractice. Physicians enjoyed special status that made them virtually immune from prosecution for negligence or incompetence. Even in cases of obvious malpractice resulting in death, physicians could claim they had followed established procedures and escape any consequences. The guild system ensured that physicians would never testify against their colleagues, creating an impenetrable wall of professional protection. Children were particularly vulnerable to medical exploitation, having no voice in their treatment and being subject to the absolute authority of both parents and physicians. Pediatric medicine was essentially non-existent as a specialty, with children treated as miniature adults and subjected to the same brutal procedures regardless of their age or size. The high mortality rate among children was accepted as natural, discouraging any critical examination of pediatric medical practices. The psychological manipulation employed by medieval physicians was sophisticated and deliberate. They cultivated an aura of mystical authority through elaborate dress, incomprehensible language, and ritualistic procedures. Patients were made to feel privileged to receive the physician's attention and grateful for any treatment, no matter how painful or ineffective. This psychological dominance made it extremely difficult for patients to question or resist medical authority. The economic exploitation extended beyond individual patient care to entire communities. During plague outbreaks or other medical crises, physicians would charge exorbitant fees for their services. while often fleeing at the first sign of real danger. Communities desperate for medical help would pay enormous sums for treatments that were not only ineffective, but often accelerated the spread of disease through ignorance of basic hygiene principles. The suppression of alternative healing traditions was systematic and ruthless. Folk healers, herbalists, and traditional practitioners who might offer more effective or compassionate care were branded as charlatans or heretics. Their methods, often based on centuries of practical experience, were dismissed as superstition, while the theoretical nonsense of university-trained physicians was elevated as scientific truth. The gender dynamics of medieval medicine revealed additional layers of exploitation. Male physicians claimed exclusive authority over women's bodies while having little understanding of female anatomy or reproductive health. Pregnancy and childbirth, previously the domain of experienced female midwives, became increasingly medicalized as male physicians asserted their authority. This shift often resulted in worse outcomes for mothers and babies, but increased profits for physicians. The training of physicians perpetuated these exploitative practices through a system that emphasized authority over competence. Medical students learned to project confidence and authority regardless of their actual knowledge or skills. They were taught that admitting ignorance or uncertainty would undermine their professional standing, leading to a culture where dangerous overconfidence was rewarded and honest assessment of limitations was punished. The documentation that survives from medieval medical practice reveals the stunning arrogance and callousness of the medical establishment. Physicians wrote extensively about their theories and their fees, but showed little interest in patient outcomes or suffering. When treatments failed, as they usually did, the failure was attributed to the patient's constitution, their sins, or external factors, never to the inadequacy of the treatment itself. The legacy of these medieval practices extended far beyond the Middle Ages, establishing patterns of medical authority and patient subjugation that persisted for centuries. The idea that physicians should be unquestioned authorities, that patients should submit passively to treatment, and that medical knowledge should be mysterious and inaccessible continued to influence medical practice well into the modern era. The systematic denial of patient rights in medieval medicine was not an unfortunate oversight, but a deliberate strategy to maintain power and maximize profit. By keeping patients ignorant, dependent, and voiceless, the medical establishment created a perfect system of exploitation that enriched physicians while causing immense suffering. The dark secrets of medieval medicine include not just ineffective treatments and dangerous procedures, but the fundamental betrayal of the trust that patients placed in those who claimed to heal them. This exploitation was enabled by a broader social system that valued authority over truth, tradition over innovation, and profit over human welfare. The medical establishment worked hand in hand with religious and political authorities to maintain a system that served their interests while causing immeasurable harm to the very people they claimed to help. The true measure of medieval medicine's failure lies not just in its inability to heal, but in its systematic abuse of the most vulnerable members of society who sought help in their darkest hours. Here's part 11 of the 12-part script for the dark secrets of medieval medicine. As we've explored the disturbing world of medieval medicine, we've witnessed how ignorance, greed, and superstition created a system of institutionalized suffering that persisted for centuries. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this dark legacy wasn't just the ineffective treatments or the exploitation of the vulnerable. It was how deeply these practices became embedded in the very fabric of society, creating cultural attitudes toward healing and authority that would echo through generations. The medical practitioners of the Middle Ages weren't simply misguided healers trying their best with limited knowledge. They were active participants in a system that prioritized profit over patients. authority over evidence, and tradition over truth. The physician who prescribed bloodletting knew full well that many patients weakened and died from the procedure. The apothecary who sold mercury-based remedies understood the toxic effects of his concoctions. The surgeon who performed trepanation was aware of the horrific mortality rates, yet they continued these practices because they were profitable, socially acceptable, and legally protected. This institutionalized cruelty created a medical establishment that was fundamentally predatory. Patients weren't seen as human beings deserving compassionate care, but as sources of revenue to be exploited until their resources were exhausted or death intervened. The sick became commodities in a marketplace of misery, where the more desperate the patient, the more expensive and dangerous the prescribed treatment became. The psychological manipulation employed by medieval medical practitioners was particularly insidious. They cultivated an aura of mystique and authority that made questioning their methods tantamount to heresy. Latin terminology, elaborate rituals, and expensive equipment served not to improve outcomes, but to intimidate patients into submission. The more incomprehensible the treatment, the more patients were convinced of its sophistication and necessity. Women and children bore the brunt of this medical exploitation with devastating consequences. Medieval obstetrics was a horror show of ignorance and intervention that turned childbirth into a death sentence for countless mothers and infants. Practitioners who knew nothing about anatomy or sterile technique would force traumatic deliveries, perform unnecessary procedures, and administer toxic substances to laboring women. When complications inevitably arose, they blamed the patient's moral character rather than their own incompetence. Children were subjected to equally barbaric treatments, often based on the absurd belief that their small bodies required more aggressive intervention than adult patients. Bloodletting was performed on infants barely old enough to survive the procedure. Purging medicines were administered in doses that would challenge a grown man's constitution. The concept of pediatric dosing was completely unknown, leading to countless poisoning deaths that were attributed to divine will, rather than medical malpractice. The economic incentives driving medieval medicine created a system where patient suffering was literally profitable. The longer a treatment took, the more visits required, the more expensive the ingredients, the better for the practitioner's income. Recovery was actually bad for business, creating a perverse incentive structure where practitioners were motivated to maintain illness rather than cure it. This led to the development of chronic treatment protocols designed to keep patients dependent on medical services indefinitely. The guild system that controlled medical practice was essentially a legalized monopoly that suppressed innovation and protected incompetent practitioners from competition. Any attempt to introduce new methods or question established practices was met with professional ostracism and legal persecution. The guilds existed not to improve medical care, but to maintain the economic and social privileges of their members at the expense of patient welfare. Perhaps most disturbing was how this system normalized suffering and created a culture where medical torture was accepted as healing. Patients were conditioned to believe that effective medicine must be painful, expensive, and unpleasant. The more a treatment hurt, the more convinced they became of its therapeutic value. This psychological conditioning made patients complicit in their own abuse, actively seeking out harmful procedures and paying handsomely for the privilege of being tortured by medical professionals. The spiritual manipulation that accompanied medical treatment added another layer of cruelty to an already barbaric system. Practitioners convinced patients that their illnesses were punishments for sin, making recovery dependent on moral reformation rather than medical intervention. This allowed them to blame treatment failures on the patient's spiritual inadequacy, while positioning themselves as righteous agents of divine justice rather than incompetent healers. The long-term consequences of medieval medical practices extended far beyond individual patient outcomes. entire populations were systematically weakened by treatments that destroyed rather than restored health. The cumulative effect of generations of medical abuse created communities where chronic illness, disability, and premature death were accepted as normal parts of life rather than preventable tragedies. The legacy of medieval medicine's dark secrets continued to influence healing practices long after the Middle Ages ended. The authoritarian relationship between doctor and patient, the emphasis on expensive and complex treatments over simple remedies, the suspicion of women's medical knowledge, and the belief that suffering was inherently therapeutic, all persisted well into the modern era. Even today, we can see echoes of these medieval attitudes in healthcare systems that prioritize profit over patients and maintain artificial barriers to medical knowledge. The true horror of medieval medicine wasn't just its ineffectiveness, but its deliberate cruelty disguised as healing. It created a culture where the vulnerable were systematically exploited by those claiming to help them, where ignorance was elevated above evidence, and where human suffering became a commodity to be harvested by medical predators. This wasn't simply bad medicine. It was institutionalized torture masquerading as healthcare, leaving scars on human civilization that took centuries to heal. Understanding this dark history isn't merely an academic exercise. It serves as a warning about what happens when medical authority goes unchecked, when profit motives override patient welfare, and when society accepts suffering as inevitable rather than demanding better. The victims of medieval medicine deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as human beings whose agony contributed to the hard-won medical advances we benefit from today. As the dark secrets of medieval medicine draws to a close, we've peered behind the veil of history to witness the shocking realities of healthcare in the Middle Ages. From bloodletting and trepanation to bizarre remedies involving unicorn horns and mercury, medieval physicians operated in a world where superstition often trumped science, and good intentions frequently led to deadly outcomes. While we may shudder at these primitive practices today, they remind us how far modern medicine has advanced and how fortunate we are to live in an age of antibiotics, anesthesia, and evidence-based treatment. The courage of medieval patients who submitted to these harrowing procedures and the genuine desire of healers to help despite their limited knowledge speaks to the enduring human spirit in the face of suffering and uncertainty.